A very warm welcome to all of you to today's exclusive session. We are honored and privileged to have amidst us Dr. KANTI GHOSH, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India. Dr. Ghosh will be addressing on the theme, Indian Economy Amid Global Headwinds, a New Paradigm. Mr. N.G. Khaitan, President, is unable to be with us as he underwent a dental surgery today and has been advised by the doctor to take rest. Mr. Rajkumar Agrawal, Vice President of the Chamber, will be presiding today's exclusive session. May I request Mr. Agrawal to formally welcome Dr. Ghosh to the session with the Uttaryo. Can we have a huge round of applause? May I now request Shri Agrawal to deliver the welcome address and commence today's session.
Good afternoon, members. Dr. Ghosh, members of the Chamber, guests and friends. I welcome you all to today's exclusive session entitled Indian Economy Amid Global Headwinds, a New Paradigm, organized by the Chamber this afternoon. The guest in chief for today's session is Dr. SOUMYA Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India. At the outset, I would like to extend a very warm and hearty welcome to Dr. Ghosh in our midst. I'm sure that Indian economy enthusiasts are well acquainted with Dr. Ghosh, since his articles and commentaries are frequently published in reputed dailies. He has served in key positions at renowned organizations such as Tata AIA, American Express, ICRA, and the FICCI. He is famously known for his pioneering work in capturing payroll data, both in the formal and informal sectors. He played a significant role in designing successful schemes like the PM Kisan for farmers and ECLGS for the MSMEs during the pandemic. Given the erudition of Dr. Ghosh, I am confident that at today's session, we would be able to get a clear picture of the Indian economy from a very impartial point of view. Sir, I would like to take this opportunity to inform that the Chamber had the privilege of being addressed by the former chairman of the State Bank of India, Shri Rajneesh Kumar, at a special e-session during the early days of the COVID pandemic. I fondly recall that Shri Kumar's address was enlightening and raised the morale of the industry during those hard times. Friends, the theme for today's session is the cornerstone of any discussion on the Indian economy in recent times. In her budget speech, the Honorable Finance Minister observed that despite the global economy operating under an extremely challenging macroeconomic environment, like the geopolitical tensions in Europe, spiraling energy, food, and fertilizer prices, monetary tightening, and inflationary trends having elevated the downside risks to the global economic outlook, the Indian economy is estimated to grow by 7% year on year in the current fiscal. The Government of India has assured that the measures announced in the Union Budget 2023, like a rise in capital expenditure, increased focus on infrastructure development, boost in the green economy, and initiatives for strengthening financial markets are expected to promote job creation and foster economic growth. Measures announced by the MSME sector will likely reduce the cost of funds and aid small enterprises. Revision in tax slabs under the new personal income tax regime is expected to boost consumption, thus providing more impetus to economic growth. In this context, I would request Dr. Ghosh to share his views as how plausible do these statements sound in actuality. Sir, one of the principal areas of concern for Indian economy is its weak consumption demand. India's consumption demand has always been its strongest bulwark against any possible global recession. However, India's private consumer spending, which comprises about 60% of India's gross domestic product, rose just 2.1% year over year, compared with an 8.8% increase in the third quarter of FY23. As a result, the country's manufacturing sector's performance also weakened. GDP growth was only 4.4% in the third quarter, down from 6.3% in the year-ago period. This can be attributed to higher interest rates and elevated inflation. Slower growth in rural spending after some pandemic-era subsidies were cut could have been also played a role. Higher borrowing costs will probably continue to pinch pocketbooks, especially in the urban areas, as the Reserve Bank of India remains laser focused on reining in stubborn inflation. However, despite an aggressive rate-raising cycle, retail inflation jumped to a 3-month high of 6.52% in January 23. It appears that the task of the RBI has become more difficult in the current context. I would request Dr. Ghosh to enlighten us on the measures that can be taken to break this vicious circle of inflation and slumped growth. Another area of concern is the counter-cyclical nature of India's current account deficit. Large and persistent CADs expose India to the risks associated with its financing. While FDI inflows were enough to finance the deficit in 21-22, these inflows have been weak in the current fiscal year. FDI and portfolio inflows each only financed about 18% of the CADs in the current quarter of 22-23. I would request Dr. Ghosh to elucidate how India can address the twin problems of widening fiscal and current account deficits. Sir, it is needless to mention that the launch of the ECLGS in 2020 helped businesses survive during the lockdowns and the pandemic. According to the Financial Stability Report of the RBI, banks have disbursed loans up to rupees 2.5 trillion to MSMEs till September 30, 2022 under this scheme. However, the growth in the loans to the industry has stagnated, with the banking sector checking in 8.7% growth in January 2023. The moderation is on account of the slower pace of growth in MSME credit, which was the main driver of the growth in loans since April 2022. In addition to the MSME sector, credit growth to large industries too has witnessed moderation from 10.5% in November 22 to 6.5% in January 23. One of the chief reasons is definitely the rise in borrowing costs with hike in repo rate. In this regard, I would request Dr. Ghosh to outline a few measures which needs to be adopted to further boost the MSME sector's performance. I would also like to propose that in addition to other sectors, The education sector needs to be included amongst other beneficiaries of the ECLGS, since the sector equally bore the brunt of the dislocations caused during the pandemic. I feel that despite all the downsides to the economy, India has been predicted to remain the fastest growing economy for the next fiscal by multilateral organizations and rating agencies. I would say that our neighbors, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, are in serious trouble economically, and their chances of revival appear to be bleak given the performance of their macroeconomic parameters. India's economy is far from such a condition and is expected to remain resilient in the face of a looming global recession. Before concluding, I would refer to the recent budget plans of the US President Joe Biden. In pursuit to filing the deficit, he has plans for taxing 0.01% rich by 25% and raising tax revenue of US $4.7 trillion in the next 10 years. Sir, I would request you to share your views on the implications such a move may have on Indian economy. With these words, I would conclude my address and request Dr. Ghosh to commence his address. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be over here. So I have actually been trying to adjust for a suitable timing to come and visit Kolkata. So I think finally it has been made possible. So thank you again for this opportunity. And what I will do is that I have a presentation with me, and the questions which you also asked are mostly a part of the presentation. So I will answer all of them. And regarding the budget also, I think I will talk a little bit about the budget, but given the fact that budget was published in February, so maybe a part of that is not in the presentation, but I will mention the parts about the budget, the external sector, the inflation, the global outlook, the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, the small scale industry, the credit growth, everything. So what I'll do is that I would like to operate the slides on my own because it will make my thing easier. So if I can just go there, I can sit here, whatever is possible. Okay. Okay, thanks. So this presentation basically, talks, and since I'll share a copy of the presentation at a later date. So I think what I will do is that there is also lots of information in that slides in terms of the data. So I will talk about all of them, but you can actually, if you have any question, you can ask me after the presentation. So, but anyway, I will have an address to all of them. So the idea of the presentation is that the Indian economy continues to be resilient. To put it on the record that for the last 3 years, India will continue to be the fastest growing economy. If I take the period from 2015 or 16, I think in the last 7 years, it will be the fifth occasion when the Indian economy will be the fastest growing economy. In between 2 years, I think 2000 prior to the pandemic, and just before that, the economic growth actually had declined. But if I take aside those factors, I think the economy has been doing well. This year, the growth rate is projected at 7%. Notwithstanding, I'll talk a little bit about the quarterly growth also, notwithstanding the quarterly growth of 4.4%. 7% will be the highest, and last year growth rate has already been revised upwards to 9.1%, and the COVID year growth rate is now at minus 5.8%. If you remember why I'm talking about resilience, when the pandemic had hit us, the growth rate forecast, I think, of all economists were actually in double digits. But then the CSO first estimates was at minus 7.3%, if I remember, contraction for the pandemic year 2020-21. It was revised down to minus 6.6% in the second estimate. It has now been revised downward to 5.8%. And the important point is that, which is also there in the presentation, is that we actually, I think we had a lot of discussion at that point of time that the manufacturing sector and the construction sector has been one of the hardest hit. And that was, of course, that was well taken by everybody, given the fact that the economy went through and lockdown period and other things. But remarkably, the latest data numbers which has come shows that the manufacturing and construction sector upward revision in data has been on the order of around 1 trillion. In fact, for the last 3 years, 2020-21, 21-22, 22-23, the average revision in GDP growth rate has been around 2.1 trillion. And in the pandemic year, the average revision upwards has been 2.6 trillion. So these are not small numbers. So my point is that, yes, if you look into an overall picture, there was a slowdown, but I think the way the economy has bounced back, and I will talk a lot, I'll talk about all these sectors. I think it has been remarkable, and a large part of that credit should go to the vaccination drive, which we had. We know that in May 2021, I think all of us, I think in this room, I may be correct if I say that almost all of us had contracted COVID in some form or the other. But I think the remarkable vaccination program, which India did, was a lot way responsible for putting the economy back in track quickly. We also, if you remember, in 2022 beginning, we had the Omicron. Omicron also, we are not severely impacted. And very recently in China, I think in January, all of us were discussing that what is happening to China. And there was also the airports, there was screening from people who are coming from these places. But again, if you see, I think the number of cases actually did not went up. So my sense is that the vaccination drive had a large part to play. If you just look into the history of the vaccination, the drive which started, and a large part of this is also reflected why the economy actually witnessed resilience. So with these words, I will take you through the presentation and I will answer some of the questions in between which have been raised by panelists. See, in terms of the global economy, I think the problem is that today also the markets have been down. I think there's news of regarding that there's a banking sector crisis in the US, and I think this type of things will continue to come. Tomorrow evening, as we speak, after 6 o'clock, I think the US numbers will come. And the remarkable part, and I will talk to you about this thing, is that the US economy was the Fed, basically. If I tell it, I think the Fed was very late in raising the rates. In 2021, if I remember, in March 2021, the labor market in the US already was showing signs of a significant uptick, but the Fed continued to ignore that. And if you look into the Fed commentary, the first Fed commentary where the Fed, the chairman Jeremy Powell said that it was a transitory. Then it is said, then he said it's temporary, then it said it's permanent, then it said is that, so basically transitory, permanent, temporary, higher for longer, and there's all sorts of communication has come from the Fed. But the moot point is that the Fed was late in raising rates, and the things have now gone to such a pass that I think even as the Fed will continue to raise rates, I think the labor markets in the US is unlikely to climb down from its tightness. And that is having consequences on the emerging economy in terms of the rate hikes. And that is the challenge we are facing, because if Fed raises rates, the general perception in the market is that we need to follow the Fed. So basically, but my sense, and we have been writing about that, is the time has now come for us to get decoupled from the Fed in some sense or the other. India is a country has done quite well in terms of its diplomacy and other things. So in terms of policy also, I think the time has now come to get it decoupled from the Fed. Anyway, if you look into this growth forecast over here, all the countries, if you look into, I think the Indian numbers are over here have been revised is 9.17 and 6. These are the IMF growth forecast. And if you look into all these numbers of other countries, India is the fastest growing. In terms of the inflation, I think latest inflation is 6.5%. I'll talk a little bit about the inflation today because there are some issues regarding the inflation in terms of the methodological biases which have crept in, because the inflation is based on the methodology which is 2011 and 12 consumer expenditure survey. But the point is that in terms of inflation, yes, it is at 6.5%, and this month's inflation number, I think this month means the February inflation number, which will be released on Monday, could actually reflect a similar number, 6.5%. So that could actually raise the haggles of another bound of rate hike by the RBI in April. But I'll come to that later. But in terms of inflation, I think India is not done badly if we leave aside the last numbers. The problem is that the debt vulnerabilities and global financial condition is excavating the balance of payment condition in many developing countries. India, fortunately, is not one of them, as I will show you through some of the data. This is basically the high point, is that the commodity prices cycle. If you look into energy, agriculture, fertilizers, metals, precious metals, all of the prices growth rate, these are the year-on-year growth rate. You can see that the year-on-year growth rate has now been trending in the negative territory. So that is almost similar to what we started in January 2020 before the pandemic. So that's actually is an indication that global growth is going to slow down very rapidly. There are debates in US that whether the US economy will go through a soft landing or a hard landing. As of now, the data suggests that it could be a soft landing. But again, the only point which I would like to make in this, that today what is certain in this world is only uncertainty. The word uncertainty is only certain in this world. So, and given these significant market disturbances, the US data, I should still not say that it could be a soft landing. There could be reasons to believe that the global economy could get into a slowdown mode more than what has been being currently anticipated. This is basically the important point, is that this time we are having a too much and too soon rate hike. This is basically the RBI rate cycle. If you look into these important points, I think there is a lot of data over here, but what is important is that what was the quantum of rate hikes, which is basically in the last column, and what is the number of policies which is take. If you look into the experience of this after if you remember 2010 to 2012, when we had a huge inflation problem, food inflation was running double digits, the RBI raised rates by 375 basis points, but that was over 14 policies when Dr. Subbara was the governor. And then if you look into these policies, this time there has been 6 policies. The number of rate increase has been 250, which is still ongoing. And this 250 excludes, there was also an adjustment at the lower end of the policy corridor. I think the RBI abolished the reverse repo rate, basically the lower band, that was by 40 basis points. So if I take that factor into consideration, the total rate hike is 290 basis points over 6 policies. So I think there has been a rapid rate hikes. RBI has front-loaded the rate hikes, and this has benefited the economy in terms of slowing down of the inflation. But the problem is that after a certain point of time, given the fact that rates, we are now in a regime of external benchmark lending rate, means that if the repo rate goes up by 25 basis points, your rates will also go up by the same amount, because everything is now linked to the repo rate. And this has been, I think, implemented in the last 3 years. So the speed of the tightening is actually worrisome, and an economy which has been coming out of COVID, I think more tightening, and this is the problem with all central bank. I mean, when you are tightening, if there is a rapid over tightening, it could lead to the financial condition could be disorderly, or it could be over tightened. And as you know, that financial stability is one of the most important considerations. And today the markets actually was witnessing some semblance of financial instability given the news from the US. So this is basically the problem this time, that the rate hikes have been front loaded, but at some point of time, there could be issues in terms of an over tightening, and it is not to blame any central banks, because central bank has been doing their job diligently. The RBI has done a phenomenal job in terms of controlling inflation, but the sense is that at some point of time, I think there has to be a challenge of how far you need to pace up with the Fed, because the way the inflation, the way the labor markets are behaving in Fed, and I'll show in one of the slide, I think that it will be very difficult for the RBI to follow Fed, because that may need multiple rate hikes over the next 1 or 2 policies, including the April 1. This is basically the important point. I think this slide is very important. Look into this slide. The US has been, the Fed has been raising rates. The idea of why does one raise rates? The idea of Fed raising rates is that it wants to increase the unemployment rate in the economy so that the labor market actually becomes flexible. But look at this peculiar condition in US. The labor market unemployment is actually declining in the US, meaning that, and that's actually no economic theory will suggest that if there is a rate hike, there will be lower unemployment. So basically, if there are rate hikes, if the financial conditions tighten, obviously there will be lower hiring, notwithstanding the specter of news from the tech. There has been a lot of layoffs from the tech, but overall unemployment rate in US is actually declining. And this is something which is a remarkable development. And the other important thing is the job vacancy rate. So the job vacancy rate is increasing, the unemployment rate is declining, indicating most probably that during the COVID, the labor market in US has actually undergone characteristic changes, so that the more skilled of the people have now is there. The US is unable to match the job vacancy with the unemployed people in terms of the skillful rate. There are reports that during the COVID, there's a lot of people actually has left the US labor market. So this is the problem. So if this continues, that means that this will lead to a higher nominal wages. This will create a wage price spiral. And exactly this was the point which we have been discussing. I think recent the meetings, the Fed is now talking about a 50 basis point rate hike in the March, another 25 maybe in May, another 25. So that will actually take the rates closer to 6%. And this is basically the problem which all of us are going to face, that no way the unemployment rate is going to be pushed up as the Fed was expecting. And if this is the trend, I think that could spell trouble from the US labor market and also for the Fed in terms of the rate hikes. So this is basically the most important challenge for us today in terms of how do you decouple from the Fed, because there is no point in saying that we need to raise rates, but we need to raise rates and be specific to our own condition. This I will not get into this one. This is basically a very one. The only point we just can see is the rounded figures, is that in April 2003, the US inflation is unlikely to reach, it will be still at 4.7%. And by 2000 and the way things are moving, if you look into December 2023, the US inflation could still be at 5.3% if the rate of increase is at 0.4% sequentially, which was the last time it increased. At 0.3%, it could be at 4.2. So it could be a summer and a winter of rate hikes by the Fed, which could actually spill over the next couple of policies. And this you can see that the meeting probabilities, you can see that in the April policy, now 70% of the people believe that the rate hikes could be as high as 50 basis points. In May policy, 22% of the belief, 60% of the people believe that it could be 25 basis points, and there are till 22% of the people believe that it could be another 25. So I am leaving aside that one, but my problem is that the expectations of rapid rate hikes in the Fed is actually getting momentum. Now, having said this, having pointed out this conundrum in the global economy in terms of US and what could pose challenges, let me now point out to some of the good things about the Indian economy. This is basically I think this will answer a lot of questions. I think there has been a lot of news recently regarding the India's quarterly GDP numbers. It was at 4.4%, but I don't know what was the noise regarding, because our expectations was at 4.6% and a full year growth rate was at 7%. The point to note over here is that, and I think a very valid point which you raised regarding the consumption slowdown, that it was grew at 2%. But let me take out some time to explain the intricacies of the data. I think, and actually the answer also led there. You also answered the same question when you said that the last year, at the same quarter, the growth rate was 8%. So this 2% consumption growth rate was because of a very high base last year. A better way to look into is that how the consumption has grown from the last quarter to this quarter. And if I look into that number, that growth is 7.3%. So sometimes some numbers, like in statistics, an average hides more thing than it reveals. So in this case, I think a better proxy is that you should look into the sequential growth on growth, because we are coming out of a pandemic whereby the data has been extremely noisy. There are significant data revisions, and it will be very unfair to talk about on quarterly growth rate when there has been contraction of 20% in the first quarter of 2020-21. There was an increase of 17% in 2020-21. So I think taking all these factors into account, the best way to look into is that look through the noise, look through the cycle, and look into the yearly growth rate. Once the growth rate stabilizes, then you can look into the year-on-year numbers. And year-on-year, if you look into my quarterly numbers this time, the point which I mentioned, consumption growth rate remains strong at 7.3%. Of course, this consumption growth of 7.3%, if I compare with the pre-pandemic consumption growth, during the same quarter, it was around 8%. So it is still at not that level, but I think at 7.3%, we are not doing that badly as we may have, as the data may have suggested. Now, this is another data which I want to highlight. This is also a very data insensitive. This is the point which I wanted to look into, the number of data revision which has happened in the Indian data. For FY 2021, 22, look into the numbers. The old numbers was actually 20% growth rate GDP Q1. This number that came in at 21.6%. Every number is witnessing a significant upward revision. And the important point to note is that manufacturing construction sector has not done that badly during the pandemic. There was an upward revision of 1 trillion in the data. So if I take these upward revisions in the data out of the picture, the GDP growth actually at 7% is actually higher than this one. But let me not get into these numbers game, but this is one point which I wanted to highlight. Now, this is another data, is that the per capita GDP growth rate. This is basically in current terms. In real terms also, if you look into the per capita GDP, that has gone by around close to 5%. If I exclude the pandemic disrupted year. Look into these numbers from 2011-12 till 2020-23. The per capita GDP, if you look into it, has gone up to around 2 trillion. And a large part, this is a CAGR of around 10.6%. Real terms, as I said, this number is in excess of 5%. The important point to note is that this year also there is a huge jump in the per capita GDP, which is around 25,000 rupees, which means that per month there's a growth of around, I mean, if I say it very roughly, is around 2,000 rupees. So a large part of that has been made possible because of the leakage, the benefits leakage, which has been plugged by the government through these DBT transfers. The total number of DBT transfers in the last year since this government came to power has been around rupees 28 trillion. Rupees 28 trillion is the amount of money which has gone through DBT, and that actually has saved a lot of money in terms of the leakage. So the benefits of actually that is now getting visible in terms of better numbers in terms of the per capita. And even if there are reports which says that if you look into the distribution, that is not a part of this slide, but if you look into the distribution of the per capita income across states, I think that is narrowing down, and that is also a good sign of an economy which wants to aspire to get to 5 trillion in the next couple of years. I'll come to that number also. This is another important thing. I think nobody talks about this one. Savings in India, I think this is the savings number. I think you can see that in FY12, the savings was 34.6% overall savings. That had continued to decline. That was at 32.1, but after the pandemic, the savings was at 29.6%. But in FY22, there has been a remarkable jump in savings. And important point is that private sector savings has inched up from FY20 levels. The public sector savings, which had declined in FY21, has now recovered a little bit. As you know, the government runs a huge fiscal deficit. The government fiscal deficit, government dis-savings was at minus 6.7% FY21, but that is now at minus 2.7. And household financial savings is actually now at 19.7%. It has declined from 22.4. But the important point is that overall household savings consist of two parts: financial savings and physical savings. In financial savings, you know that there was a significant increase in deposits during the pandemic because people were unable to spend the money. But that has now moderated. But what has improved is that the real estate sector, the physical savings by the household and the MSME have increased to close to 12% in 2021-22 from 10.7. So there has been a 1% of GDP growth, 2 trillion incremental growth in physical assets of the household and the MSME, and which actually has been held by a very low interest regime. That's why we will see that the India's real estate sector has been actually seen some sort of an bounce back during the pandemic, and this is still continuing to some extent. So this is another good thing. The second thing is that look into the investment numbers. The investment numbers had declined from a peak of 33.9 in FY18 to 27.9 in FY21. In 22, they have jumped to 31.4. And my sense is that this number has crossed 32% in FY23, which is basically the highest from FY20. Private sector invest. I think all of you ask about why the private sector investment is not coming up. You can see that the private sector investment actually was not doing that badly since FY19, but after that there was a steady decline. But in FY22, on the back of a significant ramp up in public expenditure, government public expenditure, 3.8 to 4.2%. I think government, as you know, the government has been doing a lot of capital expenditure. The private sector investment has also picked up from 10 to 10.8%. Of course, it is lower than what it was in pre-pandemic at 11.6%, or for that matter, the highest was at 13.6% in FY13. But I think the way the things have been moving, my sense is that this private sector investment should be able to grow in the next year or so. In the current year, FY23, the data is not available, which will be available 1 year later. But my sense is that if I look into the numbers, these numbers, quarterly numbers, the overall gross capital formation should have crossed 32% in FY23. So savings and investment, we have been able to recover significantly. So therefore, the talks about a lower growth rate, a trend growth rate just doesn't stand scrutiny if I just look into these numbers. This is the institutional share. I think I'll not get into that. The total gross fixed capital formation, you can look at the private sector investment is still 34%. You can see that this number was at 42% in 2015-16, but this number has declined. But my sense is that this number will recover in the next 1 or 2 years. It already recovered. Now, let me talk about a very important concept which actually brought out very recently. I think a concept is that the incremental capital output ratio, basically, which talks about how much growth is going to be supported. You can see into the incremental capital output ratio over the years. During the pandemic, obviously it was negative, and it actually was very insignificant. The capital was basically very unproductive during the years of FY19 till 21. There has been a significant rebound in FY22, FY23. If I assuming that the investment rate is 32%, the incremental capital output ratio is actually at 4.6%, which favors, which looks very pretty if I compare with the FY15 numbers when it was at 4.5. So in all sense, I think if I look into the incremental capital output ratio, if I look into the gross domestic savings, if I look into the gross domestic investment, I think we are doing well. And these are all parameters of ensuring that a growth rate is sustained at 7% or more in the coming years. This is now I'll come into some of the important data points which I'll show you. First, let me talk a little bit about the UPI transactions. The total UPI transactions since it was launched from 2016-17 has jumped by 1,801 times. And the total GST, you know that the total UPI transactions today is likely to touch around 48% of India's GDP. Currency in circulation has stayed at 12.1% of GDP over the last decade. And UPI transaction in the last 5 years have actually jumped to 48% of India's GDP, which is, I think, one of the most creditable achievement of all of us, because there has been a shift in the behavioral shift in the public. GST collection consistently has been touching 1.5 trillion. I remember in May 2021, when we were at the height of the devastating pandemic, the GST collection was still at 1 trillion. And I think, and because of that, I think the state's fiscal positions and the center's fiscal position continues to be very better. States, if you look into the state's revenue to GDP ratio, tax to GDP ratio, they are actually at record highs after the pandemic. Fortnightly is credit growth. I think fortnightly credit growth actually has been at 10-year high. There's been some moderation, but I'll explain the credit growth. But if you look into the credit growth, the important point to note is that all sectors of credit are happening. In the last month, there was a slowdown in the retail credit growth. But if you look into the SME sector, the SME sector was 10% of the overall industrial credit growth. And the credit growth actually was at 10-year high. The asset quality of the banks actually at the best in the last 10 years. And if I look into the FDI inflows, last year was 84.8 billion gross FDI inflows. This year, for the 9 months, it has been 55 billion. At this rate, this number could be a little lower than 84.8 billion, but still, I think it will be a creditable achievement in a year when the global economy has been ravaged by headwinds and geopolitical conflicts. I think every day there's a new geopolitical conflict with the visit of the US president to Ukraine, I think recently. I think, and given the fact that the saber rattling by the North Korea, then South Korea, then China, then Russia, then Iran, I think Saudi Arabia. So I think there is a whole lot of geopolitical conflict which has opened up. In that sense, I think this number is also quite creditable. This is one important thing, and this will answer the question on the current account deficit. Look into Indian exports of goods and services. Last year, the total number of total goods and services exports were 420 billion in goods, 250 billion in services. That made a number of 674 billion, which is a jump of 1.5 times from FY12. This year, for the first 10 months, the total service exports has already crossed 254 billion. It is at 270 billion. Total goods exports is at 369 billion. And at the current rate, the total goods export could match 420 billion of last year, but service exports is likely to cross 300 billion. In fact, the projections today, and we have been saying this for a while, that the total numbers this year could be in excess of 750 billion. At the beginning of the year, all of us were talking about a current account deficit, which could have been close to 4%. Today, we are all talking about a current account deficit, which will be lower than 3% and at 2.8%, thanks to this significant jump in the service exports. You can see that the service export this year has been doing remarkably well. One good thing over here is that the market capitalization, as you know, that there has been markets in the last 1 month has been volatile. But even after that, and this graph, if I had shown you 1 month back, the increase in the Indian market capitalization was actually at 2.4 times. Today, this number is at 2.1 times over March 2020, which is still higher across any countries if we compare across the globe. In terms of the new demat accounts, the total number of new demat accounts which was opened, I think, till November 2022, if I remember, it was around 64 million with a per capita amount of rupees 9 lakhs. So there has been a change in behavioral, change in the households where they are now getting more into the stock markets, and that is good. And remittances have increased by 1.6 times in the last 7 years. So that is now at 100 billion. So just look into these numbers. All of us talk about that. Yes, there is a problem with the economy, but look into these numbers. We are all talking about a global slowdown, but Indian exports and goods and services are likely to top last year's number of 674 billion. So numbers actually does not support. I'll not take much time, but I will go through some of the other data points which are very interesting, and then I will answer all your questions. This is some of the data points which came out recently in a report that reported this, and this is basically has been the hallmark of this current government in terms of access to latrine, drinking water, cooking, mobile telephone. If you look into all these numbers in terms of the rural, urban, you can see that there has been a significant jump in the access. Drinking water, the government is already on a Jal Jeevan mission. Energy, and also the mobile telephone with an active. So I think all these numbers show The blue bar is basically for the latest round, and the other bar is for the earlier round. So all these numbers actually show that India is doing quite well in terms of the social inclusion. I just wanted to show you these numbers. This is the institution of bank accounts. Today, the total number of percent having a bank accounts in rural areas is actually 92.2%. Female also have 86.4%. One data I always talk about this data whenever I visit, basically the empowerment of the woman. In 2022 March end, the total incremental deposits which came into the banking system from the rural areas, 66 rupees of that were contributed by women. Today, there's a program which the government is running, is the SOUMYA scheme, whereby it is want to give property rights to all 6 lakh villages across India. In our database, and there are, I think, as all of you know, the government is running 124 aspirational districts. This time they have made 500 blocks. In these aspirational districts, in some of the districts which are backward, the women are now actually overpowering, or if I use the word overpower, or I think surprising men in terms of taking loans from bank to construct their own houses. So this is basically a new India where you are looking into an empowered woman, and they are taking their financial decision. The Jan Dhan accounts today, which has been opened of 480 million, 56% of that has been opened by women. And today, these accounts are actually used by women for taking financially empowered decisions. And as all of us know, if the woman takes a decision of the household, that is always, I think, supposed to be the best in terms of the rationality of the expenditures and other things. So this is one thing which I wanted to highlight, and this is good for all of us. I'll not get into all this. Basically, how the wealth is getting created in the India. Everywhere we are now getting wealth. I think top 80 to 90 cities are now providing wealth when you look into our data also, and technology is getting the more important thing. And there are a lot of initiatives the government is actually doing. The ONDC is one initiative, the Ocean is one initiative, whereby they will move all the MSMEs into this one. This is the investment announcements, which I wanted to show you some of the numbers. I think all of us talk about this number. There is an announcements and implementation. New investment announcements were 10 trillion in 2021, and already they have crossed 21 trillion in the first 9 months of FY23. They can cross 25 trillion in the full year. And the important point to note is that out of the announcement, the ratio of implementation is basically around 35 to 40%. So even if I take 35% of 25 trillion, I think that's a big number in terms of the investment announcements. And you can look into the sectors: chemicals, roadways, electronics, community, real estate, non-conventional energy. I think it has been across these sectors, but the idea is that this is basically a strong infrastructure push which the government is giving to the entire spectrum of industries. Finally, this is the rating upgrades, downgrades. I think all sectors, Indian corporates have significantly deleveraged in the pandemic years. If you look into the rating performance, the upgrades in their rating are more than the rating downgrades now. And some of the green numbers like fertilizers, IT, energy, gas distribution, automobiles, telecommunication, everywhere you can see that there has been an improvement in the upgrade to downgrade ratio. If we compare FY23 over FY22, improving that the corporate balance sheet is now stronger than before, and we are ready to embark on an investment cycle as and when it gets momentum. This is another important development which I wanted to show from FY15. What has happened? This is always unnoticed, that the average registration per day of companies have jumped by 50%. It is now 600 from 400 in the pre-COVID years. So this is something I think, and a lot of this is also happening in the sunrise sectors. So basically today on a per day, we are registering 600 companies, which was around 400 during the pre-pandemic levels. And you can look into these numbers, how it has changed from FY15 till FY23. So again, in terms of the entrepreneurship and other things, that has done a significant increase. This I'll not get into this. Indian banking sector capital adequacy ratio today is actually better than China, and almost comparable and better than USA and almost comparable to USA. Our capital adequacy ratio today is 16.8%. US is actually at 14.9 and China is also at 14.9 and Australia is at 17%. Credit growth, as I've already said, gross NPA of NPA has banks have declined significantly. Today, it is actually at 10-year low. So the banking sector asset quality is one of the best which has happened. And this has been one of the reasons. I remember when the pandemic started, that there was a lot of reports in the press that the Indian asset quality issues could actually jump to NPA could jump to 20 trillion. Today, this number is not even 1.3 trillion. Our gross NPA ratio, SBI is actually 20% of the Indian GDP. Our gross NPA is today is at just a little bit above 1% and net NPA ratio is 0.7%. This is perhaps one of the best in the last 10 years. So that's why you are so confident about the growth in the market, because if the banking sector is adequately capitalized and good capital adequacy ratio, I think that is one of the best things to have happened. And the credit should go to the RBI, the banks, all of them has worked together to get borrower discipline into the system. And this has worked remarkably well for all of us. This is the UPI transactions value. You can look into these, how these numbers are. I think this is basically some sort of a fairy tale that the graph is actually moving vertically upwards. After the COVID, you can say it started and it has actually gone almost single-handedly in a vertical way. And this is the UPI transactions. And I think a lot of good things are happening because of UPI transaction. If I have time, I will discuss about it. This I will not get into because the deposit growth rate has been, deposit and credit growth of the banking sector also has been good. This year, the total credit growth has been 14.5 trillion. Deposit growth also has been 12.5 trillion. So that actually is one of the things which is happening. Let me now spend the last few minutes on this 5 trillion journey. I'll show you some slides which basically is very important. This is the history of India's GDP growth rate from 1950s, from Jawaharlal Nehru to Indira Gandhi to I think to Morarji Desai to Rajiv Gandhi to Narasimha Rao to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and final to the Prime Minister Modi. So this is actually, this is the first US trillion we reached in 57 years, second we reached in 7 years, third we reached in 7 years, fourth in 3 years, fifth we are going to reach in 3 years. We have jumped 10th place in 2014, our size was 10th. Today we are at 5th place, and 5 trillion is the estimates by 2027. And you know that India's, the aspiration is that we need to do every 1 trillion, we are now doing it in 3 years. The aspiration is that we do 1 trillion in 2 years. Last 2 years, we have actually done 750 billion. So that's not a small number. So the aspiration is that if we are able to do close to 2 trillion, and if the rupee remains remarkably stable, even if we assume that rupee depreciate by 1.5% and there is 2 trillion addition every 2 years, the size of the economy could be close to 20 trillion by 2047, which all of, I think the Honorable Prime Minister calls it the Amrit Kal, but that's the level and that's the objective which we need to look into. But this is basically a task which has to be performed by all of us. And the important point to note over here is that there could be ups and downs over here. Unfortunately, if the COVID had not happened, we could have reached the 5 trillion earlier than 2027. But this basically shows that we have been able to remarkably cut down the growth in US trillion as we have moved over the years. But the aspiration is that do 1 trillion in 2 years so that by 2047, we are in 20 trillion economy. This is basically India's transition. As you can see, in 2014, we are at 10th position with a nominal GDP of around 2 trillion. In 2022, we're at 3.4 trillion. Global share has moved from 2.6% to 3.5%. The India is just behind Japan, Germany, China, and US. I think hopefully we'll cross Germany and Japan. Maybe by an hour of the estimation that the number could come as early as 2029. The third is 2028, means March 2029, we could hit the third largest economy in the world. But of course, we have a distance to travel because we need to catch up on the per capita income, a better proxy. But I still believe that a per capita income should be in purchasing power parity. But we should be proud about whatever we have been doing in the last, last decade or so. And this is basically what could be an 5 trillion economy look like, I think, and this will answer the share of the industry should cross 30%. I think this is one of the areas where the government is trying to push the industry to a significant level. I think there's a lot of discussion about that, why India has turned inward in terms of Atmanirbharta. But let me give you some examples. In 2008, when the global financial crisis opened, the US economy also had turned inward because they wanted to be dependent on the shale production. And that actually came through with remarkable success. China has been remarkably inward, and they have pushed manufacturing at the lower end. And I think there is no harm if we try to do Atmanirbharta in terms of reducing our imports from China. We did an estimate. The estimates are not over here. Is that today around 55 out of 55 billion imports from China, 38 billion imports are coming in sectors where the government has actually launched the PLI scheme. If we are able to cut down on this 38 billion imports even by 10 to 30%, the total addition to GDP could be humongous. And over a point of time, I think India can become a 5 trillion economy. The nominal US dollar terms growth has been 9.1% average. And we have also achieved a growth rate of 10% from 2020 to 22. So that's not a big deal. But the only thing is that we need large companies to accelerate the growth, because large companies and mid-sized companies growing in scale, and I'll talk a little bit about this growing in scale after this slide is over, is important for us. So I think this was the last slide. I will end here, and I would like to talk a little bit about some of the questions which you asked, and then I will answer your, if you have any questions, I'll answer. The first important point to say is that in terms of the SME sector, I think West Bengal is one of the states where there's a lot of preponderance of SME sector, apart from states like Uttar Pradesh. Let me talk a little bit the SME sector. I think when the pandemic happened, there was a lot of discussion that the SME sector, being a large part of the informal economy, was impacted. Yes, it was impacted. But I think the best thing to have happened to the SME sector was the credit link guarantee scheme, which had done remarkably well. And we also did a study which shows that I think it saved more than 1 crore or 5 crore livelihoods from getting into poverty or losing their jobs at that point of time. The other important point to note is that the government has recently launched a portal called Uddam portal. The information there is in public domain, you can have a look at it. In India, the unfortunate part is that after 2016, there has been no survey of any MSME sectors in India. A total number of MSME units. That survey in 2016 had said that the total number of MSME units in India is around, I think, 60 million, of which 99.4% were in micro sectors. Now, after this, what this current government is doing on the Uddam portal, it is now registering all the MSME units so that they can be formalized into the credit delivery system if some of them has not been formalized. If we look into the GSTN portal, the total number of MSME who are paying taxes around 1.4 crores. On the Uddam portal, this number has already crossed 1.4 crores, basically 14 million. The idea is that on 4th January 2023, the government came out with a circular saying that if the unit is micro unit, even if they don't have papers, they may not have a PAN card, but they could be always registered on the GSTN portal from the back end, so that at the end of the day, they could be formalized into the banking system. Today, if you look into the data on the MSME per capita MSME sector, the per capita MSME micro sector loans is actually around 3.5 lakhs, if I remember it correctly. So and the total number is today registered is around 1.4 crores. The total numbers counted in 2016 was around 6 crores, 6.3 crores. So even if I assuming that this 1.4 crores goes up to 3 crores or 3.5 crores through this backend addition on the Uddam portal, and I am sure this number will go up significantly because the government has done significant success in registering the unorganized laborer on the eShram portal, where they have registered 28.5 crores over a period of 5 months. So if that is the case, if 3.5 lakhs is the per head amount, is another 3 crores is actually registered on this Uddam portal. You can understand what could be the amount of credit which would be formalized into the banking system. So the MSME sector, the government is giving a lot of effort. And in the current budget also, I think they have now said that they will want to link the beautiful artisan industry in India. I think as all of in West Bengal also, in Rajasthan, several states, we have a beautiful artisan small scale. They will link up these artisans with the value chain. And in our database, remarkably, I will say that we have seen that there has been several MSME units who have now moved out of the ambit of the MSME and grown bigger. So basically, this PLI scheme which the government is running, this is started to help these MSME units in terms of getting bigger as they are getting integrated into the value chain. And every change, I think, needs some sort of an, as noted, I mean, the Nobel laureate Richard Thaler's in terms of a behavioral change, a behavioral push. The pandemic has seen a lot of behavioral push in the Indian economy in terms of changing in behavioral habits of the savings of the households, moving more to the financial markets, financialization of the savings. The government is trying to bring a new tax regime also in terms of moving to a new tax regime. My sense is that as the GST collections move up from 1.5 trillion, there could be more opportunities for the taxes to come down under the direct taxes. So this is also another change which is happening. And our sense is that in the next, and there is a significant, and the government is also in the budget, it has said that for the agricultural sector, it will bring up a database in terms of an UPI type data, which will be basically a public good. So basically all the information will be available on the on that public domain, so that you can actually, this long-standing problem that potato cost 20 rupees in the market, and but a potato chips, if you look into it, actually, if I look at the comparable 1 kilo potato chips, that will cost around 300 rupees. So this linkage between the fork to the value chain, I think that has been one of the problems. Unfortunately, the agricultural reforms the government wanted to push did not happen. I mean, some reforms are difficult in this country, some are politically sensitive for whatever reasons. But I think at the end of the day, the agricultural sector reforms the government has done, the number of KCC guards today is actually around 7 crores. So basically 70 million farmers are now having KCC codes. That means your credit is formalized with the banking system. Earlier, what used to happen is that these farmers used to get to the money lenders who used to charge a rate of interest of 24 to 36%. And this is also one of the reasons that gold loan actually has seen an explosion in the Indian context. And most of this gold loan actually is sourced from the southern parts of the country, where gold is actually used as an investment option, unlike the eastern part of and North Indian part, specifically in India, where gold is considered more as sacred the tool to keep. So, and finally, on the inflation front, I think inflation, I will say only a few things, is that yes, there has been some the inflation has been a little bit stubborn in the context. It has significantly declined. But let me tell you also, one of the things is that today the inflation, that is not to say that inflation is not a problem. Today the inflation is actually interesting observation is that it was based on 2011-12 consumer expenditure survey. Food has a 46% of weightage in that inflation. Today, if you look into the private final consumption expenditure of households data, which came out on 28th February, you will find that the fair share of food of households in overall expenditure is 28%. So look into this anomaly. The CPI number was based on a survey which talks about on 46% weightage of food across states. Look into the private final consumption expenditure of household in the National Account Statistics. It talks about 28% the expenditure on foods. So if I just replace that 46% to 28%, the 6.5% inflation could actually come down to 5.6%. So, but I'm not making that as an excuse to say that inflation is more than estimated. But my sense is that we need to now look beyond some of these issues, conventional issues, because at some point of time, methodological issues could come to bite us. But I would like to end here by saying that we are now in the cusp of a transformational journey. Any transformation takes time to percolate down to the bottom or of the bottom of the pyramid. And if you look into all sorts, if I look into the numbers, I think one of the best things to have happened is terms of the empowerment, the financial empowerment of the women. Recently, we estimated that if we just estimate the contribution of women in the households, which is never measured, that could be around 7 to 8% of India's GDP. So let us recognize the strengths of us, Of course, there would be challenges, but over a point of time, I'm sure that we'll be able to overcome all these challenges and emerge stronger than what, as we have said, during the pandemic. Because all of us were talking about a growth rate deceleration of more than 10%, but we today are a next deceleration of only 5.8%. I'd like to end here and thank you for the opportunity.
Friends, our president, Mr. Khaitan, has joined us. Now, if you have any questions to Dr. Ghosh, anybody has any observation?
Dr. Ghosh, good evening. This is Romit from PTI.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Dr. Ghosh, you mentioned something very significant about decoupling from the Fed. What do you think should be the approach for this, and how feasible is this for a country like India?
No, I think we have said this at the beginning, because the point to note is that if you look into the 2008 rate hike cycle and the rate cut cycle, you will see that central banks, when they raise rates in unison. But when they cut rates according to a country-specific factors. So my only point is that, I mean, the way the US, I just showed you the data, the US labor market, the job vacancy rates, and it's actually remarkable that the US unemployment has actually declined. The Fed was expecting it to touch 5.5 to 6% soon, so that they can actually make an end to the rate hike cycle. But if this is the trend, and we can expect more rate hikes from the Fed, the initial numbers was actually at 4%. Today, the expectation has moved to 6%, which is 200 basis points higher than the initial expectation. So my only point is that, can we take, if Fed goes to that level, can we match Fed the pace stroke by stroke? So at some point of time, we need to see, because our repo rate link, I'll give you a numbers, but 6.5% were the rate in April. Today, these rates are more than 9%. So at some point of time, I think we just need to maybe if we just need to pause and see whether the impact of the earlier rate hikes has percolated down into the system, because otherwise what is going to happen is that I don't see any end to the Fed rate hike cycle soon. I see around 3 rate hikes as of today sitting here. It could be higher. Last time when we were discussing, we were saying 2 rate hikes. Today we are now saying 3 rate hikes. It could be 4 tomorrow. So that's my limited point, is that sometime we just need to sit down and decipher what could be our pace of rate of action, whether we need to decouple it from the Fed, or we need to see that we are keeping pace with them. So my sense is that this is something to debate at some point of time.
Thank you.
Coach, I'm very sorry that I had a dental appointment. So, once you have a dental appointment, you can't miss it. So I told them that I'll be late today. And I went through your presentation. I mean, the only thing is that you were too fast, and we could absorb many things, but then we need time to go through your presentation. If we have a copy of that, then we'll go through that. But your presentation has been very eye-opening for me. But I would like to put few things. They say that it's a new India. Everybody is praising India. We have become the most populous nation in the world. We have the largest number of migrants in the world today. Everybody is praising India. You will continue to be the fastest growing economy in the world. It's all good. All good things are happening with India. In fact, you talk to any world leader, they speak very highly of India. You talk to any economist, they speak very high of India. I have few concerns which I felt. One is the El Nino effect, which is being said that, this country, this particular year, 2023-24, we might be affected by El Nino effect. And, as we know that our dependence on rains, it's monsoon rains is so dependent. And if we have deficit of monsoon, what will be the impact? Because basically half of the population is dependent on agriculture. I mean, they are dependent on agriculture. What would be the impact if the El Nino comes into effect? The second is, they say that there will be a recession worldwide. I mean, most of the economists say that there will be a recession worldwide, except for very few countries. I mean, exception of China and to some extent an exception of India. And of course, there will be no. But what would be the effect if there is a worldwide recession? I mean, are we going to be affected by this worldwide recession in some way? Because the recession is going to set in and it is affected a lot of countries to their exports. They are dependent on other countries as far as the exports are concerned. The rate of dollars are becoming expensive and expensive. The third issue which really concerns me, the rate of interest in India is going very high. I mean, the lending rate is going very high. The deposit rates have gone up. So if the deposit rate goes up, the lending rate to the industry is going to go up very high. What would be the impact of that? The other is deglobalization. We were talking of globalization. Now we are talking of deglobalization. We are talking of self-reliant India. I mean, if every country becomes self-reliant, then what happens? I mean, this is one issue that self-reliant again. Other was that globalization is the pinnacle of growth. Today they say deglobalization is the pinnacle of growth. What would be your take on that? And I really don't know that, today Mr. Khemani is here. He sent a note to me saying that the Biden administration wants to raise the rate of taxation. And of course, that's true to that extent. I mean, they want to raise the rate of taxation, and it's a capital gain tax is going. The recommendation is to go from 21% to 20% to 39%, and the corporate tax from 21 to 28. Whereas in India, we feel when the Trump administration came to power, they reduced the corporate tax to a great extent, and there was a total the entire industry in the USA were rejuvenated. And this is what happened in India also when the new industry came, and the rate of tax for the new industry was reduced to 15, but surcharge coming to 17, and for the other companies 25%. Though of course we are told that the Republicans will not allow this to happen. But why is the Biden administration feel that increasing the rate of tax would revive their economy or tame their unemployment, or would be able to tame their recession? I mean, if the rate of tax goes up, will it help in recession? Will it help in unemployment? I really don't know. This is something which I have not been able to understand. They say that it will not go through because the Republicans have the majority in the House of Representatives. So the recommendation of President Biden will not go through. But I have not been able to understand. As you as an economist, I would like to understand the fallacy of having a low rate of tax and the fallacy of having a high rate of tax. I think these were few issues which were troubling me. So I thought I would like to have your views on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll answer your questions. And regarding the presentation, I think I had other things to say also, but since the information, I think the information which have been we have compiled in the presentation is basically a lot of things are not talked about. So maybe you can have a look into this at leisure time, and if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer on the email. So because I think so that's the first thing.
If we can have a soft copy.
Soft copy I'll share.
Yeah.
So this is basically because there are so many things to say, and maybe maybe it could take an hour or even 1.5 hours to go through this. But let me answer most of the points which you have raised to these questions, and also to any others who have any question. The first thing is regarding the El Nino. I think it's very good that you answered this question. Again, for the history of the last 50 years, there are studies which we have done. A study is that all El Nino years doesn't result in a drought. In fact, there are many examples saying that in El Nino years, the rainfall actually has been more than average. So I think even, yes, El Nino is a concern, but to say that this El Nino could actually result in higher food prices or food inflation or drought is not supported by data, because it's there are many examples. As I said, El Nino actually talks about the year where the rainfall has been more than average. I can give you examples also on this one. So this is point number one. Regarding the other points which you raised in terms of the deglobalization, let me talk about a very important point, I think, and this is very important point, I think, and that is also shown in the data. Is you know that India is a current account deficit country, and this will also give you an what I will say, an futuristic vision. When the year started, all of us were working with a current account deficit numbers of in excess of 100 billion. I think the number is not important, because the number, what is important is whether you're able to finance that deficit or not. Remarkably, at that point of time, the only contrarian call in the market was by the Reserve Bank of India. In one of the conferences, they said, we believe it will be less than 3%. And today, this contrarian call actually has been proved correct, because if you look into the service exports today, this has been a remarkable growth in the service exports of India. Last year, overall growth was 420 goods, 250 services. This year, the first 10 months, we have already crossed 270 billion services, and this number could be close to 330, 340 billion, if my estimates are correct. And that is one of the reasons why a higher current account deficit will, at the end of the day, this number could actually be not a problem. And Indian current account deficit, in terms of simple arithmetic, could now be much lower than 3% this year. So this is second point. Related to this, and this is also important for us to understand, that if the global recession happens, what will happen to India? There are talks that there could be a slowdown in the exports, but let me give you another interesting insight from a study which we did. We actually recently did an economic exercise of 19 exports through various various global cycles of slow growth, high growth, and tried to find out what is the relationship with Indian exports. You'll be surprised to find out is that out of 19 commodities which we took, 14 commodities we found that they were actually macro agnostic, basically agnostic to the global business cycle, indicating that even if global growth declines, exports will actually not significantly decline. Out of 19, 14 commodities. One of the reasons which came to my mind is that India is today exporting a lot of the skilled one in terms of engineering exports, and the other exports which has picked up remarkably is agricultural exports, which generally, if I believe, is that given the fact is that the geopolitical conflict, other reasons, I think agricultural exports will not be sensitive too much to a global cycle, because at the end of the day, every country needs food at their disposal. So my sense is that if that is the case, and that is also one of the reasons that export growth rate today is at 370 billion for 10 months. And generally the March is always very good. So even if we do around 30 to 40 billion in the next in 1 month, if we do 40 billion, will be more than 420 this year, which I think nobody thought at the beginning of the year when in terms of these unprecedented rate hikes. Now, coming to your final point in terms of if every country goes for a deglobalization, I think that's a very interesting point. But as I said to you is that, let me talk a little bit over the PLI exports over here, because that will give a perception. I think PLI, there has been a lot of discussion in the public domain. Some discussion has been very critical, saying that what is the purpose of giving a production subsidy? But let me on some PLI, some numbers I will tell you. India's budget, this comes the budget over here. In this year's budget, the first thing is that capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP is the highest in the last 17 years. Subsidy as a percentage of GDP is the lowest in the last 17 years. And revenue deficit to fiscal deficit is the lowest in the last 18 years. So and in this background, the point to note is that PLI, we are spending around 2 trillion of money. This 2 trillion is 1% of GDP. If you look into a subsidy on petroleum, 1 trillion reduction in petroleum subsidies has taken place over the last 4 to 5 years. That means this subsidy adjustment has gone to a productive expenditure on PLI, which is supposed to create jobs. So the effective PLI expenditure has only been, in the slide is unfortunately not here, I can share you the data. The overall expenditure on PLI is only 1 trillion, because if I take that 1 trillion into account, and on several sectors, like in the exports, I think the cell phone exports, we are seeing that exports are now going by 60 to 70%, even though it is coming over a very low base. And as a number I said to you, the total imports from China in the first, if I make a comparison estimates over here, it could be as close to 60 billion. Not 60 billion, the number could be higher, but the important number is that around 50 to 55 billion could be from sectors where India has introduced this PLI. So my simple point is that, and the share of imports from China in 2021 was around 15.5%. If I remember, today this number is at 13.7%. Unfortunately, the pandemic had raised the numbers, but it is again coming down. So the idea of the government is very good. We are going after Nirbhar because we want to reduce our dependence on China on imports. We import around close to 100 billion from China. Out of this, 55 to 60 billion comes from sectors which we can produce on our own, like electronics and other things. If we are able to cut down 10%, 20%, 30%, 50% over a period of 5 years, that could add a significant addition to our GDP. So the point is that in times, it is better to go get your own dependency improved. China has done it in 2008-9 when China actually entered the low end of the manufacturing scale and then it vacated it. India is now trying to get into that segment. US has done in 2008 when it ramped up shale production because it wanted to reduce its dependence. The important point to note is that after this geopolitical conflict, and important data which I wanted to show you, Germany had not built up its, I think, this LNG pipeline, even though there was numerous proposals from other countries. And that's why there is so much of this energy dependence on countries like on Russia. And these, I think it's LNG terminal, if I remember, there were a lot of talks, and now they're thinking of actually doing this. So it is better to do when the iron is hot. Yes. Empirically speaking, if every country wants to get their job done in their own domain, it could become a difficult, but there is no harm in trying to do something which we are dependent from outside. This will take time, but I'm sure that we are in the correct direction because we have to reduce our, we have to have a proper balance of payment, current account deficit with China at the end of the day, because otherwise this problem is never going to go away. And this has been, we are on the right track, but the pandemic actually disrupted everything in terms of a significant increase in imports from China. So these are my observations. Finally, on this trillion, 5 trillion one, which I said to you, is that we are actually recently preparing a note also for the government where we are talking about this. This rupee internationalization is something which we need to do with more alacrity now, because at the end of the day, all this talks upon 5 trillion. Today, if the rupee value of the rupee is at 50, we are already at 5 trillion. So therefore, it is important that the rupee stays stable and it depreciates not more than 1.5% or so in the next 20 years, so that we can actually aim of becoming a 20 trillion economy by 2047. And the idea is that we have a remarkable digital revolution. Because of the digital revolution, the RBI is also introducing the central bank digital currency. We had not discussed the presentation, but the central bank digital currency is an innovation whereby it is going to make the payment across boundaries. For example, these remittances seamless and costless. So there are many examples of trying to, and this RuPay card, which is now available in more than 20 to 30 countries. So if I take all these factors into consideration, I think, but these are all steps in the right direction. But fortunately, unfortunately, it will take time. So maybe we hope that we all are alive and kicking in the next 20 years to see that this transformation is happening, and it's happening at a good step, because some of this transformation also, for example, nudging people to move from an old tax regime to a new tax regime is difficult. all of us, including me also, because we have been brought up in a situation whereby savings are more often directed than encouraged. But let me tell you that these are all good things, and hopefully this change in behavior, that people putting more money in the financial markets or stock market, which I never thought would have happened in a country like India, is now happening. And because of their retail participation only, the stock market, even though it has gone through so many, has gone through volatility, is still maintaining levels of 60,000 at this when, and the market capitalization has increased by 2.1 times since pandemic, which even after a meltdown from 2.3 to 2.4 at the beginning of February is still the highest across all countries. So these are all things which are happening, but my sense is that there are challenges remain in terms of the informality of the economy. The economy has become a large part of that, it became formalized in the last 4 to 5 years. That is also a good thing. And the things which I said to you, the SME sector, if we are able to register those micro units in the MSME sector, which is most prevalent in states like West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, I think all of us will benefit at the end of the day, because we need everybody to be accessible and get credit from the banks. There are reports that people are now getting credit from the financial system at rupees 160. So that should be the level of engagement with an institution. You do institution, get to the bottom of the ladder, get loans at the lower end. Women are now surpassing men in several districts in terms of setting up houses and getting loans from bank. Our bank data shows that, and I have the data. We have the presentation is on the website. If you want, we can have a say. I can share the presentation. So that's the level of empowerment and the woman which has been happening. But these are all processes. So my only sense is I need to be a little bit patient. There are challenges, and some reforms are very politically sensitive. And it is understandable also, because this will take time. This will need to change our mindset. But at the end of the day, if this is good for us, we need to look into it from a holistic perspective.
And what about the interest rates, sir? The interest rate is going high and
See, that's the point which I mentioned over here, is that I think interest rate, for example, with the loans which are 6.5 to 6.7% is now more than 9%.
Yeah.
That's why I think at some point of time, the central bank, RBI, has done a remarkable job, but at some point of time, we need to take a pause and look back whether we just now decouple from the Fed, whether or not decouple from the Fed, because otherwise what, I mean, the story from the Fed is not going to change in the next couple of months. March, there could be 3, as I said too, when we started last year, we are saying 2, now it became 3. Now someone are saying it is 4. Someone are saying it's only 25. Now the bar is 50. So what do? If they do 50, do we have to do 25? We have brought it down from 50 to 35 to 25. Either we need to bring it down to pause, or I mean, we need to ensure that at least there is an end to this rate hike cycle, and that should be data dependent. Otherwise, at some point of time, this could hurt and recovery, which is just getting broad-based, and the economy has recovered. I mean, I can call it an incipient recovery, which has become broad-based, and higher interest rate may not be the ideal way to look forward into it. I understand the predicaments of the central banks across the world, including our central bank. They have done a tremendous job, but this is the problem. When Fed raises rates, I mean, you don't know, I mean, what to do, but we have to do what we want to do at the end of the day.
No, I had many points, but anyway, somebody else wants to raise some points, they can. But I have not understood, as I said, the dilemma as to what the Biden administration want to do by
Exactly.
raising I mean, I have not been able to
No,
understand.
Biden, I think the idea of Biden, this increasing taxes, I think, sorry, I just missed that question. I'll give you an history of US. Actually, I have been going through a book by Blinder. I was just going through. We in India, we all talk about that our fiscal policy, dominance of monetary policy. But we failed to recognize that this fiscal policy, monetary policy dominance, nobody writes about it. That was the hallmark of in US, in developed economies. In 1960, when Kennedy was the US president, and they had an economic council which had 4 Nobel laureates, including Kenneth Arrow, including James Tobin, including Paul Samuelson. All of them are Nobel laureates and brilliant economists. I think at that point of time, it was suggested that we need to cut taxes so as to reinvigorate growth. And the unfortunately, Kennedy assassinated, the next president took that step, But then after the Vietnam War happened, and then what I will say, then the entire burden came on fiscal policy as a devil, that because of this, the inflation started to move up. But in 1968-69, the rates actually, the US increased the rates. If I remember it correctly, increased the personal income taxes rates at that point of time. So US actually has a history of cutting rates and increasing rates, and that has happened in the 1960s to 70s if you look into their record. So I am not surprised that this to and fro of about cutting rates and increasing rates, but my sense is that it will not go through, first thing, which you said correctly. And the second thing is that it's more to do with basically revenue mobilization, because the debt burden in US actually has gone to significantly high proportion, and the monetary policy, we had a significantly lax fiscal policy in the US, and now they actually want to move from that regime to some out and harder taxation. So if you ask me the reason, I can give an example which happened in 1960, a tax cut, then Vietnam War, then inflation. Then unfortunately, they increased the taxes, but the inflation did not come on down. But fiscal policy was branded as an evil. So if I take the same corollary, the same conclusion today, I can see a similar experience today. Tax cut, then the pandemic, then again, then rate increases. Now fiscal policy wants to play second fiddle to monetary policy. So I think that could be the reason. I don't see any economic reason behind that in terms of why they are thinking of raising. So this is what, but there's a history of it in the US, 1960s. And that's a remarkable story of history, whereby you cut it, rate it, Kennedy assassinated, then it happens. And there were 4 Nobel laureates.
Thank you very much for your well-compiled presentation, which was really very encouraging. You had given your observations and comments between Fed as well as RBI, and coupling as well as decoupling of rates. But one observation which I feel is, I may be wrong, it has become a compulsion for the governor here to do it, because if they don't do it, there would be flight of capital from India, which is again substantially, which is there in bonds, debts, and other capital markets. If suppose they come up with another 2% this year and they come to 6+, I think, and India doesn't do matching or at least balancing on that part, the people would, all the money which has been invested here will go back and be parked there in bonds.
No,
My second question is, Fed's to curtail inflation, Fed's approach of raising rates, will it not lead to another subprime crisis as it happens? Because, you know, the housing installments and all definitely is all linked and goes up substantially. So there may be another crisis coming.
See, 2 things I want to point out over here. Regarding your first point, I think this is an interesting observation, but let me tell you that here also a new thinking is now required, that interest today in the globalized world, the capital flows are not sensitive to interest rate differentials to that extent. In fact, we have been studying this for the last several months, several years, and now we can see that there is no systematic pattern of interest rate differential impacting capital flows. From July, I'll give you a number over here. From till July, there was a capital outflow of around, I think, 15 billion portfolio from the market. From July till date, the capital inflow which has been recouped actually has been around 12 billion. So we have received negative inflow this year. So what does that mean? Interest rate, Fed has continued to raise interest rates. We have also continued to raise interest rates. So interest rate differential, I think the time has now also to come for the central banks to think beyond this interest rate differential, because this is not working in that way. There are several reasons for this. We can have a discussion on that. But my sense is that until and unless we don't get out of that mindset, interest differential, we'll be always hiking rates, and which has to, at some point of time, there has to be an thinking. So, and that is not, that is not unfair, because we are now a global power. If you believe that we can do it, why can't we do it? I mean, there could be some disagreement, but interest differential is not the factor. The second point is that, regarding your point on the subprime crisis, I think the most important things to point out is that the other data which I wanted to show, that Indian markets have actually witnessed jumps in those days where the US inflation prints have been significantly higher. In November, December, we have seen. So we have actually, our markets have moved the opposite way, even though the global markets have not. So interest differential is not the factor fully. The second thing is that in terms of the subprime case, I don't think that's the point right now, because as I showed to you one of the graphs, banks today are very sound across global economies. India's banking system is also one of them. US, all other countries' banking system today is very sound. 2008-9 crisis where basically because of the factor that liquidity was an issue, and that's why after that the Basel recommendation took place in terms of the net stable funding ratio, LSR, all this came through. And the US, so that's one thing. So that actually may not. So that means that there could not be a crisis this time, even though the landing could be soft landing, somebody is suggesting, or it could be a little bit hard landing. The other thing is in the US, a lot of these housing loans are also in terms of the fixed rates, which is not prevalent in a country like India. So my sense is that yes, there will be troubles in the US, and the history also shows of the 1970-80s. Ultimately, monetary policy in US, because of the strong asset market linkages, will be dictated by the movements in the asset market. So I'll not be surprised that if that condition also plays through this time, even though the Fed is persistent in raising the rates and bringing it down to 2%, which is not going to happen. So, and here also one factor which I wanted to mention is that in our inflation also basket, we are seeing that core inflation, which is basically the argument RBI is giving, has been becoming sticky. The stickiness is because of good reasons. People are now spending more on health, more on education, which has not happened before the pandemic. So if somebody wants to be health conscious and spend more on health and education, I think that's a good thing to have happened. So that is also happening in countries like US. So take all these factors into consideration. My sense is that possibly this time we will escape without a crisis, just the way it happened in 2007-8, because the important thing is that the banking sector today is very sound, strong, and adequately capitalized.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So just two small quick observations. One is about the privatization of banks. That, already the government is merging banks, trying to make it bigger. So if you can give us your input on that. And we find that the dollar keeps going stronger while we keep complaining that American economy is this and American economy is that. But the Indian rupee we find is now at 82 something, and soon people keep saying that it may become 85 and 100 and whatever. So if we can just have your quick views.
I'll talk the rupee first. I think rupees today is around 82. Here again, I have some observations, and I think that talks about resilient is that just think that if because of this geopolitical conflict and because of the oil prices consistently above the 100 mark, the rupee by this logic should have been well above 90 today, but it is still holding at 82. Then that actually answers a part of the question which one of the panelists did in terms of the interest differential. So that shows about the inherent strengths of the economy. At this crude consistently about 100 in normal times, the rupee should have been more than 90 as of today. That's the first thing. The second thing is that regarding the privatization, I think it's a very sensitive issue. The government has brought down the number of public sector banks to 12. At some point of time, there was a bill in the parliament that they will privatize 2 public sector banks and take it as a showcase. But I don't think we have moved much on that phase. Hopefully, this year will not be, I think, because the election is coming this year, I think, and because of the always this news about this capitalism, this crony capitalism, I will actually go a little further and say that a crony is available in everywhere. Crony capitalism, crony socialism also. So basically, that's the term which would be used across capitalism, socialism. Unfortunately, in India, we only use for capitalism for whatever reasons. But to cut the long story short, I think this is also one of the, you should allow the public sector full support in their performance, in realizing their market value. So, but today, if you ask me, it looks to me very difficult that this privatization of banks will happen this year. Maybe next year or so, if the new government comes to power and believes that could be taken forward, that could be done. Because at the end of the day, if you give the public sector banks the power they can actually, out the policy, the power, they can actually realize significant market value. And experience of India shows that whenever there has been a credit growth upcycle, the public sector banks have taken the lead and brought in terms of better incremental credit share, and then that has crowded in the private sector. This happened earlier also, and this is happening today also. In fact, in one of the economic survey in 2015, there was a very famous comment by the former chief economist Arvind Subramanian, who said that it's very strange that in a country whereby you witness the maximum growth during the years of exuberance or so ever, the private sector was the public sector banks had actually taken the lead, and the private banks were more reticent. So they came in after the 9-10 because the public sector banks had a lot of problem in terms of lending to infrastructure sector, and then they came. So my sense is that give all of them the equal footing, and I think you can then see what to do with the market value. The way the banking stocks have moved, removing the last month, has been remarkable in terms of realizing their share, realizing the potential.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. That was all-encompassing address and the kind of interest you generated. That was commendable. I would request our president to present a memento to Dr. Ghosh. I would now request Saurabh Khewani to kindly propose a vote of thanks.
Dr. Ghosh, members of the chamber, guests and friends. At the end of the exclusive session on Indian economy amid global headwinds, a new paradigm, it is my most pleasant duty to propose a very hearty vote of thanks to Dr. SOUMYA Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India. Thank you, sir, for kindly sparing some of your valuable time in addressing the members of our chamber today. According to the World Bank's latest India Development Report titled Navigating the Storm, while the deteriorating external environment will weigh on the Indian growth prospects, the economy is relatively well positioned to weather global spillovers compared to most other emerging markets. I am confident that the Indian economy will remain resilient in the years and decades to come. Thank you, sir, once again for your very interesting observations. My thanks are due to the representatives of the media and their presence at this session. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the members of the chamber for making it convenient to attend the exclusive session. With these words, I would request you all to join me in carrying a hearty vote of thanks to Dr. SOUMYA Ghosh with appreciative acclamation.